Good morning, students. My name is GOVINDH. Today we shall discuss a topic called greedflation. Now, greedflation is a combination of two words. One is greed and second is inflation. Greed is your desire to create more wealth, your desire to make more profits. Inflation is a consistent increase in the price of goods and services. So, greedflation explains an increase in the price of goods and services, a consistent increase over a period of time as a result of corporate greed or greed to make more profits. Now, if you observe, inflation regarding your horticultural products, tomatoes, onion, potatoes, now we expect the price of rice, pulses, maize, and edible oil to also increase in the coming months. So what explains this increase in the price of these essential commodities, And this concept called greedflation has gained a lot of significance in the recent past. Now we shall look at what is this topic called greedflation. You find the price of tomatoes increasing, right? What was 10 rupees a kg in April or 5 rupees a kg, shot up to 300 rupees per kg. 200 rupees per kg. Of course, now it has again come down to about 60 or 70 rupees per kg. Now you find the price of onion increasing, 35 rupees, 40 rupees a kg, and due to this, you will also observe the government trying to step in to control the increase in the price of onions. Tomorrow, it could be potatoes, Tomato, onion, and potatoes are three inflation-sensitive edible products or food commodities which are highly prone to inflationary pressures, Greed to make profits, greed to increase the profit margins, leading to an inflationary scenario is what is termed as greedflation. Yes, students, Now with this introduction, let us move to the concept called greedflation and explain its various dimensions or contours called greedflation in the news. An increasing consensus in Europe and the US that greedflation is driving the rising cost of living rather than just inflation. So basically now greedflation has become a global phenomenon, a phenomenon which is mostly seen in the developed economies like US and Europe. You find inflation in US to be at a 45-year high, inflation in UK and Europe to be at a 50-year high, very high rates of inflation. For example, the rates of inflation are as high as 8% in US, as high as 15% in the European Union and countries like your United Kingdom, Germany, the rates of inflation are very high. So that is the reason why this concept called greedflation has appeared in the news, which we shall analyze. But apart from the developed economies also, it is said that greedflation has also become a phenomenon in developing countries such as India and China, Since we are writing the IAS examination, the Indian Administrative Service examination, we shall also focus on this phenomenon called greedflation in India. Yes, students. Okay, Now, students, now let us look at the different dimensions of inflation or the different concepts of inflation. One is inflation, the second is disinflation, the third is deflation, and the fourth is reflation. So we only know about what is called inflation, which is a consistent increase in the prices of goods and services, But you also have other dimensions called disinflation, deflation, and reflation, So we shall also look at these different concepts. Now let me come to this, students. Inflation, we'll have simple definitions of each concept. What is inflation? Inflation is a consistent increase in the price of goods and services over a period of time. Suppose today the price of 1 pen is rupees 5 and let's say tomorrow it becomes rupees 8, So that is not inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is a consistent increase in the price of goods and services. It is an increase in the price of goods and services over a period of time which remains to be unchecked. That is, you are not able to check the increase in the price of goods and services. Now student, what is disinflation? Disinflation is a policy of the government to bring down prices, right, moderately, so as not to have a negative impact on growth and employment. Students, remember, right, especially in developing economies like India, you also need to have certain rate of inflation, because inflation also incentivizes growth. So disinflation is a policy of the government, right, where they try to deliberately bring down the price of goods and services, right, but not to such a low level that it will have an adverse impact on growth and employment. So disinflation has to be a very carefully calibrated policy, or a very carefully drafted policy. Then students, deflation. So what is deflation? Deflation is if inflation is a consistent increase in the price of goods and services. Deflation is a slump in the prices, that is too few money chasing too few goods. Inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, that is your aggregate demand exceeding aggregate supply, whereas deflation is, right, a slump in the prices or too few money chasing too few goods. There is a decrease in the price of goods and services, which ultimately has a negative impact on growth and employment. Students, if there are no price of goods and services, what will be the incentive for the producer to produce goods? Right? So remember, inflation is a necessary evil. Inflation incentivizes growth, but you should be able to control it within the normative limits of 4 to 6%. Then students, reflation. What is reflation? Reflation, just like your disinflation, is also a macroeconomic policy of the government to inflate the economy. That is, when there is a price slump, when there is an economic slump in a nation, the governments usually resort to what is called a reflationary macroeconomic policy. What is reflationary macroeconomic policy? You try to inflate your economy through one, fiscal stimulus, that is reducing the taxes and increasing the expenditure of the government so that it stimulates consumption demand, right? Then monetary stimulus, that is reducing the key interest rates, which is done by the central bank of the country to stimulate growth and employment. The third strategy of reflation is structural reform, that is bringing reforms in the economy. So a combination of fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus and structural economic reforms is what is a reflationary macroeconomic policy. So students, inflation, disinflation, deflation and reflation. 4 very important concepts which has to be understood from the perspective of both developed economies and developing economies. Since India is a developing economy, it is all the more important for us who are preparing for this examination to have conceptual clarity on these topics. Let us go to the next slide, students. Now, inflation, the types and solutions. Now, inflation can be of many types, right? It could be cost push inflation, price push inflation, running inflation, walking inflation, right? Double digit inflation. Right? Now, if you talk about cost push inflation, what is cost push inflation, students, right? An increase in the prices of goods and services as a result of an increase in the cost of inputs, that is cost of raw materials. Suppose there is a factory which is producing iron and steel. So if there is an increase in the price of inputs which go into the manufacturing of iron and steel, automatically there is an increase in the prices of iron and steel, which are the finished products. So inflation, which is the result of an increase in the prices of the inputs or increase in the cost of inputs or raw materials, leading to the increase in the price of final goods and services, is called as cost push inflation. Now, why is there an increase in the input prices? That may be due to the lack of supply, or excessive demand for the inputs, or you are importing them at a higher cost. So many reasons why there could be an increase in the cost of inputs. An increase in the cost of inputs leading to an increase in the price of the final goods and services is termed as cost push inflation, which is a major phenomenon in developing countries like India and China, more so in India. Right? Next, price push inflation. Now, price push inflation, students, can be connected to our topic greedflation more appropriately. What is price push inflation? An increase in the price of goods and services. Yeah, why is there an increase in the price of goods or services? One could be, which I've just explained, because of an increase in the input cost, or else, right, the manufacturer, yeah, in order to protect his profit margins, might increase the price of goods and services, right? That greed to make profits, that greed to cover the increase in the cost of inputs, right? Yeah, his quest, his inclination to make more profits every quarter, every half year, every year, right? Yeah, so he will increase his profit margins. That will lead to an increase in the price of goods and services. So his greed to make more profits, right, leads to what is called price push inflationary scenario. Or else it could also be due to monopoly type pricing. That is, you've got only one firm which manufactures these goods and services, and there is lot of demand for it, right? So that could also be the reason why he would increase the price of goods and services, since it is a monopoly, he is the only producer and he have got multiple buyers. One seller, one producer and multiple buyers. The price push inflationary scenario. Walking inflation, students, which I have told you, right, that mild level of inflation which is needed in an economy to incentivize growth and employment, because we say inflation is a byproduct of economic growth. Inflation is inherent in economic growth, right? Suppose you talk about India, we say an inflation of 3 to 4%. It can be termed as walking or trotting inflation. Running inflation, right? An increase in the rate of inflation, and you are slowly moving towards the double digit 10% mark, right? Something like, yeah, once you cross the 3 to 4%, then you enter into the 5 to 6% bracket, the 6 to 8% bracket, and then you touch almost the 10% inflation mark, right? As far as India is concerned, right, from the perspective of a developing economy, the normative levels of inflation is 4 to 6%. Walking inflation, let's say, is about 3 to 4%. Once it crosses the 6% mark, that is a normative limit, and moves towards the double digit mark, then it is known as running inflation. Once it crosses the 10% mark, right, it is termed as galloping inflation or double digit inflation, finally leading to what is called hyperinflationary scenario. And once inflation crosses the double digit mark, yeah, it can have negative impact on economic growth and employment generation. It erodes consumption demand, right? It has a negative impact on the distribution of income, right? It leads to a deterioration in the macroeconomic indicators. Your levels of investment will come down, your savings will get eroded. Yeah. So once inflation enters the double digit trajectory, right, once it crosses the 10% mark, it will have a negative impact on the sustainable growth of an economy, more importantly, a developing economy. Yes, students, right? Now, inflation, yes, can be solved by, right? Now we have defined what is inflation. We have seen the various dimensions of inflation, the types of inflation, the causes of inflation. Now, right, now since there is a problem, now tomorrow as a civil servant, you will be part of what is called policy formulation, right, once you go to the higher cadres, right, and then, yeah, you will also be part of what is called primarily policy implementation, right. So once you understand that there is a problem, it is also becomes pertinent for you to give the solutions for it. See, we all know India has got several problems, but where are the solutions? That's important, right? So let us also look at the various solutions at addressing the problem of inflation, which impacts your economic growth and output. One, we said the central bank can raise interest rates to bring the overall demand in line with the overall supply. That is the central bank of the country, in the case of India, raising the key interest rate or the repo rate, which stems the flow of liquidity in the system. increasing the repo rate or the key interest rate so that the excess liquidity in the system is drained out and the credit creation capacity or the lending capacity of the banks gets reduced. Now, the central bank of a country raising the interest rate is known as a hard interest rate regime or a dear money policy. This is to address the inflationary scenario. Then open market operation reserve requirements are tools used to influence the money supply. Open market operation, students, is one of the quantitative and reserve requirements are the quantitative credit control instruments of the Reserve Bank of India. Open market operation, students, is the buying and selling of government securities, which is a money market transaction conducted by the RBI either to inject liquidity or absorb the excess liquidity in the system. Suppose during an inflationary scenario, the Reserve Bank of India has to absorb the excess liquidity. What does it do? It will sell the government securities, which will be bought by the other participants in the money market so that the liquidity is absorbed from the system. Then communication guidance from the central bank shape the public expectations and inflation targets. This, students, is known as policy communication from the central bank, where the central bank through its monetary and credit policy, right, announces its quantitative and qualitative credit control mechanisms, right, and provides guidance, policy guidance or forward guidance regarding the economic growth trajectory, regarding the control of inflation, what kind of reforms are needed in the monetary system. Then macroprudential measures and supply side policies can address specific sectors contributing inflation, right? Macroprudential, students, is prudential means being careful, right? Having a measured approach, having a calibrated approach. Macro is, you look at the larger macroeconomic policy framework of the nation, right? And supply side constraints. Suppose there's a shortfall in supply, that I said can also lead to what is called a cost push inflationary scenario or a supply side inflationary scenario. For example, right, there is shortage of coal in the country that can lead to an increase in the thermal cost of thermal power production. And if there's increase in the cost of thermal power production, that will have an inflation transmission effect in the economy. And students, there are certain sectors which are inflation sensitive, such as the food sector, the commodity trading sector, the speculative sectors in the economy, to which the flow of credit or liquidity has to be stemmed or controlled. Whereas the real or the priority sectors of the economy like agriculture, MSME, social sector, rural development sector, renewable energy, for these sectors there should be a steady and adequate flow of credit. For the speculative sectors, the flow of credit or liquidity should be stemmed. There should be credit rationing approach. Then the effectiveness of measures varies based on the circumstance, underlying cause of inflation. That's true, right? For an economy like India, which has got huge economic and geographic diversity, right, you need a number of measures. You need multiple instruments by the Central Bank of India to control inflation, because the cause of inflation can either be due to, can be from the demand side or can be from the supply side, right? So the Reserve Bank of India, which is India's central bank, has to work in coordination with the Ministry of Finance to address the problem of inflation and derive solutions. Yeah. Wage price spiral, students, right? However, businesses do not bring down the market price even when the input prices fall. If corporate greed is what is leading to higher inflation, then the whole monetary policy prescription appears even more unjust and ineffective. Yes, students, that's what I told you, right? Yeah, his greed to make more profits. In the greed to make more profits, right, he will increase the profit margins. And when there's a monopoly type pricing where there's only one seller and multiple buyers, right, that is where your corporate greed sets in, right? The greed to make more profits, the greed to increase the profit margins. Yeah. Yeah, greedflation simply means corporate greed is fueling inflation. Greedflation implies that companies exploited the inflation that people are experiencing by putting up their price way beyond just covering their increased costs and then use that to maximize their profit margins. Yeah. Yes, for example, students, let's say his input cost of production is rupees 40, right? Yeah, and let's say he adds a profit margin of 20 rupees and sells it at 60 rupees. Let's take a basic example, right? Now, why has he increased his profit margin? One reason could be because there's an increase in the cost of inputs. So he has to cover the increase in the cost of inputs, so he has increased the price of goods and services. That's one. But let's say he goes a step more, or he takes a step more in the greed to make more profits and increases profit margin by another rupees 10. Then the price of the final goods and services will be rupees 70. So this is where your corporate greed is fueling inflationary pressures, right? So it is the moral responsibility of the government to check this phenomenon. The RBI or the central bank alone cannot do it. It is where the government has to step in and control the corporate greed, through various measures, right? If the government does not do that, whatever the Reserve Bank of India does or the central bank does to the monetary and credit policy, yes, will be ineffective. Yes, students, right? Yeah, which I have told you, right? So greedflation in developed economies, US, Europe, right, which are known for following what is called mercantilist policies, right? Capitalistic economies where, right, private profit is the sole motive, right, or is the primary motive, US and Europe, right? The corporate profits in US as a proportion of national income have increased to the highest level. A study by IMF has also proved to be the same. International Monetary Fund studies say that the corporate greed accounts for 45% increase in the price of goods and services, right? Europe witnessed the highest inflation in 2022 since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. The spike in energy costs, but there was very little contribution of higher wages, right? So corporate greed is fueling inflation, right? Agreed, there are instances or there are reasons of an increase in the input cost, right? But beyond that, the corporate greed to make more profits, to increase their profit margins, is what is actually fueling inflationary pressures, right? So this is a phenomenon which is more observed in the developed economies. But students, let me tell you, this is also a phenomenon which can creep into the developing economies like India and China, because now we also follow a market model of economy where the private sector has become the major driver of economic growth and development. Yeah, greedflation in India, that's what I mean, right? So this has crept into the developing economies such as India and China. Yeah, the increase in net profits, increase in average net profit of listed companies. Indian corporate sector has generated windfall profits and huge profits, means huge profits in the post-pandemic period. So probably to cover the losses which they had suffered during the COVID period, but that should not be an excuse, right? Profits during recent times have been nearly thrice the profits corporates earned earlier. So this reflects the corporate greed to make more profits, right? And the responsibility, moral responsibility of the government to check that, to address that problem, right? Yeah, arguments against and arguments for. Yeah, arguments against greedflation, right? It's a political narrative. Businesses cannot arbitrarily set price, when instead set them based on what consumers are willing to pay. Yeah, if consumers are willing to pay, they would say, what is bothering the government? Yeah, the consumers are willing to pay, right? We are producing, right? So why should the government intervene, right? And basically they say it's a political narrative, right, wherein, right, they want to blame the corporates for inflation, abdicating their responsibility, right? Consumers ultimately determine the price of products in the market, right? We say it's a consumer's market, market economy, right? So if the consumer is willing to pay, let him pay. What is bothering the government, right? The greedflation theory in the US has lost ground upon deteriorating corporate profits. It may not be accurate to attribute the rise in inflation solely to corporate greed, right? I told you, an increase in the cost of inputs might be due to supply side constraints. But apart from that, the corporate greed is fueling high inflation. Solution, the windfall profit tax, right? The windfall taxation on petroleum products which has been introduced by the government, where they felt that the oil marketing companies have made heavy profits or windfall profits. Macroeconomic policy management, right? Accountability of central banks, making them more empowered to control and check inflationary pressures, right? Prudent counter-cyclical fiscal policy, right? Counter-cyclical is where you increase the tax rates, right? Something like imposing a windfall tax, right? Counter-cyclical, right? Pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical fiscal policy, right? Enhancing financial regulation and supervision, right? Oversight, yeah? Structural economic reform, something like your GST, right? Goods and services tax. International cooperation coordination, where, right, the government of India, the central bank, has to work along with organizations such as International Monetary Fund, the G20, and the countries, the developed economies, to address the problem, right? And cooperation between the central banks of nations is also essential for this. Conclusion: the rising profit margins of corporations have been observed, but they represent only a small portion of the overall business landscape in the US. The increase in profit margins may be attributed to the capture of market share from smaller businesses, right, during the pandemic, right? It's predatory competition. The big fish, the big company eating away the small company, right? Yeah. Where we are moving towards what is called a duopolistic economic model, where you'll have only two big corporates, right, dominating the market economy, right? Rising profit margins alone do not explain high inflation, as buyers, not sellers, ultimately determine prices, right? Greedflation is compared to cost push theories of inflation, which attribute inflation to rising input costs. Yes, but apart from that, the greed to make more profits and increasing their profit margins is fueling inflation, right, which is called as greedflation. Yeah. Thank you, students.